the heart plays a huge role in your ability and my ability to be effective at what God's called us to do, right? And he's like, that is the gift that we give to people. And it is very similar in the sense that the gift you and I have the opportunity to give to people is that we see the potential that they have and the greatness for what they were created for, even when they don't see it. And most people in the world, like I said, there's been a heaviness in our world. There's always a negativity in our world. Social media makes sure about that. And people try to cover up their inadequacy in lots of different ways. Sometimes with pride, sometimes with arrogance, sometimes with insecurity. There are a lot of different ways in which people try to hide their self-doubt or their insecurity. And the gift that we give them, right, is we see them as God created them, not as the world sees them, or maybe even as they see themselves. And our heart is to try to help them to see themselves the way God sees them. And so my question as we go into this new year is, do you still see that? What do you see when you think about the ministry that God's called you to do? When you look at the volunteers who serve in your ministry, what do you see? Do you see the child that is inside? Do you see the potential for greatness that God has created on purpose to do something of significance? Or do you see the person that hurt you, or the person who didn't show up, or the person who's not committed, or the person who's selfish, or the person who's only focused upon themselves? Or do you still see who God has created them to be? I'm going to look at a scripture, if you want to go in your phone there, to Isaiah. And we're going to look at chapter 43. But before we do, let me give you a couple of definitions, all right? Because this is what I'm praying for us and for our congregation, is when you hear the word Reformation, we often think of Martin Luther and the Reformation of the church. The Catholic Church, it kind of went off the rails. Martin Luther, who was a Catholic priest, came along and said, I don't think we're doing it right. But Reformation is not just something that, Catholics and Protestant, but Reformation means the recovery of God's purpose for us, right? A reformation is the recovery of God's purpose for his church. And if you think about it today, we say we need a reformation. It's me recovering God's purpose for me. It's recovering the purpose behind the call, the reason that I do what I do. And then if you think about revival, a good definition for revival is the recovery of God's life in us. So reformation is recovering the purpose that I have, and revival is recovering the life, the passion, the joy, right? Jimmy Butler here with the Miami Heat says he's lost the joy of playing basketball, and he's fallen in to the same trap that we all fall into. Because what's he think? He thinks that the joy will be discovered somewhere else. And if the joy, from what I read, the reason he's lost the joy is because we're not going to extend his contract, right? So it's money joy, okay? Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. All I'm saying is if he goes to another team, if they don't pay him what he thinks he's worth, he's still not going to recover his joy. Because the problem is not with the Heat. The problem is within him, right? And so revival is recovering the life or the joy of Christ in us. And I was reading and thinking about this idea of, what do you see? What do you see when you look into the people that you serve? The people that fill out a card and you're like, they say they want to serve, or they got a prayer request, or the person who's in the hospital, or the person says, can I get with you? Or will you call me? Or can we go to lunch? Or can we do coffee? What do you see? Right? And Isaiah chapter 43, and I'm going to start reading in verse number 14. And the people of God they've not been as obedient as they're supposed to be, and here's what it says. It says, this is what the Lord says, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. And he reminds them, right? They um, went through some challenges and some difficulties, and he reminds them of what he's done. He says, for your sakes, I will send an army against Babylon, because remember, they were taken captive by the Babylonians, forcing the Babylonians to flee in those ships they are so proud of. He says, I am the Lord, your Holy One, Israel's creator and king. I am the Lord who opened the way through the waters, making the dry path through the sea. He says, remember, I called forth the mighty army of Egypt with all of its chariots and horses. I drew them beneath the waves, and they drowned, their lives snuffed out like a smoldering candle. And if you read this chapter, here's the way I kind of wrote down in my notes here. It's God says, I'm going to do something, but I'm not going to do it because of who you are, but whose you are. All right? Not who you are, not because, but whose you are. You are my people. And it's important for us to realize that as Christ followers, we are his people. But then he says in verse 18, but forget all that, right? I have rescued you over and over again. I've stepped in and I use Cyrus to defeat the Babylonians. I use the Red Sea to defeat the Egyptians. But forget all that. It is nothing compared to what I'm going to do. For I'm about to do something, what's that next word? New. I'm about to do something new. See, I have already begun. Do you not see it? Right? He says, I'm going to do something new. You got to forget all that's happened is all the times that I've stepped in and I've rested. That's nothing compared to what I'm going to do, because what I'm going to do is new. Can you see it? Or have you been so defeated and overwhelmed that you can't see it? He says, I'm going to make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland. And that's my question to you. That's my question to us as a church is, can you see it? Can you see what God's going to do? And if God's going to do something new, the Bible says he can't do it in old wineskins, but he has to do it in new wineskins. There has to be a flexibility, because old wineskins, when they get filled with something new, they crack and they break. Just like jeans, right? When they shrink, it tears away. So God wants to do something new, but in order for him to do something new, we have to have a new, or you might say a renewal or a reformation or a revival in our own lives and in our own ministries. So let me give you 4 questions for the new year, okay? 4 questions for the new year to evaluate or to maybe instruct. How do we prepare for what God wants to do that is new? And it begins by asking, the first question is, what needs to die? What's on life support? Right? Now, there's a difference between being ill and being on life support. But what do you need to let go of? What needs to die? Because it's the same thing. It's like when you think about wineskins or you think about the material, it's like, what do you need to let go of? Because letting go is always difficult to do. If there is no life to it, then it's time to start thinking about letting it go. In other words, what are you manufacturing energy for that has no, if it had the paddles on or whatever, it would be, straight flat line. And there's not really any life to it. The only life to it is the life that you bring to it. And so when you think about ministry, you think about, well, what do I need to let die? Things are difficult to let die because, one, we get attached to things, ministries. Maybe that's your ministry and you're passionate about it. And, so it's hard to let it die. Sometimes we get connected to ministries because our our worth is tied to it. And it's like, well, if it dies, then that means I'm a failure or I haven't succeeded or am I going to lose my job or what am I going to do or where am I going to go? Right? All those different things can cause us to try to keep something alive that is no longer breathing. I always reminded of what John Maxwell says, when the horse dies, you have to dismount, because no matter how much you spur a dead horse, it's not going to get up and run. Right? It's just going to wear you out. The question to ask is its impact small and is its drain great? Right? Is the impact small and is the drain great? And so that's true of ministry. So as we go into this year, we all have to ask ourselves, am I trying to keep something alive that's already died? But it's not just ministries, there's also people. And while we always love people and we always want to serve people, there are certain people that you have to let go of. Right? People, just like ministries, have seasons. And whether we like it or not, that's just the way that it is. I heard Andy Stanley say one time, you only have enough tears to either cry for those who are coming or for those who are leaving, but you don't have enough tears to cry for both. And so while it's important to remind folks that you love them, to remind folks that you're here, there comes that time when if they no longer have a heartbeat for what God is doing or he's called you to do, that you have to let them go. Right? In other words, you can't give that. And how do you do that? Well, we're mainly talking about time, aren't we? We're talking about mental time. Right? There are some of us who can't let go of certain people because of the pain that they've caused us, or we can't let them go because we so badly want to see them revived. And again, you don't have that power, only God does. Right? And again, as pastors, we have this pastoral heart. We love people. It's heartbreaking that people won't follow along. But if you look at the life of Paul, right? I mean, remember Paul? He said, John Mark's not going with us this time. He left and went home, and I'm not going with. I'm what I'm doing. I'm called by God to do. It's important that I do it, and he's not going. Right? If you think about Jesus talking about how the poor are always going to be with you. In other words, there are certain priorities that you have to set out in your life, or you're not able to fulfill what God's called you to do. God's not able to do something new because you're still hanging on to the old. And that's difficult to do. The enemy loves to use your ministry heart against you. To say, well, if you really were called or if you really loved God, you would, whatever. And you have to say, no. Listen, if they want to come back to Christ or whatever, I'm here, but I can't give them this mind space because I've only got so much time in my mind. I've only got so much capacity in my mind. And if I'm always thinking about them, then I'm not able to move forward. I've only got so much time in my calendar, right? And so many times it's the person who fills out the card that we don't call back because it's the other person that's draining all of our time. And God can't do something new because we won't let go of what is old. And I'm not saying that is easy, but I'm saying that is necessary for God to do something new. And it's always difficult to let go of that which you love. And when you talk about people, you're talking about sometimes people that you love. Again, I'm not talking about being mean. I'm not talking about slamming the door in people's faces, but I'm talking about letting people go, not written space in your mind or on your calendar. You have to let go. Everything has a season. Steph and I have been dealing with our dog, Charlie. He's like, I don't know, 15, 16 years old, right? He's not going to last forever. He has to be let go, right? He's going to die. I can't put him in the bedroom dead and think, well, let's just pretend he's alive, right? Or let's just hope he's sleeping. right? That doesn't make any sense at all. And yet we often do that in ministry. And as a result, God has no space to do something new, which leads me to the second question is not only what do you need to let go of or what needs to die or what's on life support, but the second question is similar but different is what do you need to bury, mourn over, and move on? What do you need to bury, mourn over, and move on? Right? And here's the thing you got to know this. Some people in your ministry, when something dies, some people are going to have a really hard time ever letting go of that. Because you see it all the time. I see it all the time in the lives of people, right? Some people lose somebody that they love, even if it's a parent and that parent is 85 years old or 95 years old, and they never move on from that, right? They're never able to let mom or dad go. So as to be able, again, doesn't mean you no longer love mom and dad or you no longer care about mom and dad or whatever the situation might be, but there's no way to move forward in your life if you don't bury that which has died. You mourn over it. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to hurt over people who leave, over ministries that have to be allowed to die because they no longer have a heartbeat. But know that when you have the funeral, that there are going to be some people who aren't going to be able to let go. And because they're not able to let go, they're going to be difficult to deal with. Right? How many times have you stopped a ministry and then there's two families that leave because you no longer do that ministry? Even though that ministry wasn't alive or even though they didn't attend. I'll never forget, we had a fireman who used to come on Wednesday night, and when we quit coming on Wednesday, he didn't come on Wednesday night, but we canceled Wednesday night. And he decided he was going to meet with me because he was frustrated that we no longer had Wednesday night. And I said, well, you don't even come. He said, yeah, but I like knowing we have it. All right. And he left the church over it, right? Because he couldn't let it go. Whatever reason that Wednesday night meant something to him, and he couldn't let it go to move forward. And churches die when they don't have funerals for that which is dead. Right? We can go to churches here. I can take you to churches in Arkansas that no longer have any life. They're meeting, but they're dead. And the reason they're dead is not because God doesn't care, or not even because the people there aren't talented or gifted in ministry, but there's certain things that they just never buried. The pastor has left who started it, but they've never buried it and mourned over it. And I think sometimes that's what I wrote down. It's okay to be sad and to mourn, right? You don't have to pretend that that ministry didn't matter or that those people don't matter or that that's not important. Mourning is a part of healing. But you have to do that. And I just want to encourage you to go into this new year. What do you need to have a funeral for? I mean, that's kind of like the weekend at Bernie's. Some of us are dragging along dead people. And maybe the reason we're not attracting new people to our ministry or people don't want to serve in our ministry is because it stinks with the decaying bodies of the past. Right? And so we have to have a funeral. Right? Now, honor the people and the ministry and its impact. That's what a funeral is, right? A funeral is where you honor honor what that person did. You honor what that ministry impacted. You honor the lives. It's not just, secretly putting something into the ground, but it's being honest about the fact that it's no longer alive, right? And then move forward. Like I said, everything has a season. It's the reason we sold Hollandale, right? Hollandale is a campus that at one time had, 1,000 people attending, 800 people attending, maybe 12 or 1,400, I can't remember. Had a lot of people that were there, a lot of resources. Some of the folks that are here came through Hollandale. And then over time, trying different people, trying different systems, trying different things. It's like this thing is no longer living. It's no longer moving forward, and it's a drain on what God wants to do. And as long as we try to keep it going, right, so that we can say, now, again, you got to be humble enough to let something like that go, but to have the funeral and know that because something dies doesn't mean it didn't have value while it was alive. Because we get that in our minds when it comes to ministry and to people, right? We don't think about that in life. Grandma doesn't die, and we think, well, she died. I guess that means her life wasn't important. We do a better job with people when they physically die, don't we? We're like, you know what? Grandma wasn't perfect, but grandma was this. And remember that story about grandma? And we celebrate the life of grandma because we know that her life had value, even though she's no longer here. And the same thing is true of ministry. That we can make bad decisions. There can be ministries we start that we shouldn't, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Hollandale would be a great example. It was a place where lives were changed, eternities were impacted, right? Any of the campuses that we have closed, there are people in ministry today because we had those campuses at that time and it gave them a place to serve. Had we not had those campuses, they wouldn't have had a place to serve. And today they're in ministry somewhere as a result. That means they had value. They can be celebrated, right? And whether they died because it's, this season of life that happens, or whether they died because of mistakes, whatever, it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if they're dead, they're dead. If there's something to learn, we learn it, but then we move on, right? Um, and I think we'll never bury something that it's hard to move on from something that we feel had no value. And the same is true with people, by the way, right? Just because somebody screws up, or just because somebody drifts away, or just because that doesn't mean it's good for them, right? If Freddie goes out and has an affair on Mary, that's not good for Freddie or Mary or their kids. And we want to challenge, but that doesn't mean that everything Freddie did 10 years before had no value. Right. And so it's important to be able to celebrate the impact that Freddie had. I'm not talking about you throw a party for Freddie who had an affair, but I'm talking about in your own because most of what you and I struggle with happens here. Life is, it's difficult out there for everybody in every walk of life. So it's what happens here. And so many times, the enemy will tell you when Freddie had the affair that all the time you've invested into Freddie didn't matter. It didn't make a difference. You're not good at what you do. Your life is not having him. All right, all those things go into your mind because ultimately, as I said, last weekend or the weekend before, the enemy's number one goal is to get us to surrender on our calling, to surrender on our vision, what God created us and gifted us to do. And so he'll tell us that, right? He'll tell when somebody hurts you or somebody walks away, that doesn't mean that it was all in vain. That's what you're going to think. That's what the enemy's going to try to tell you. But it's important. Have the funeral, mourn, and move on, which leads me to the third question. So first question is what needs to die, right? It's on life. What needs to be, what needs to have a funeral? In other words, you need to really, it's dead and you're no longer doing it, but you're still, you haven't dealt with it. Or that person left and you just tried to ignore it. Or you've tried to we try to make them into bad people so that we don't have to mourn their exit. And we don't do that with real people, right? I don't want to cry over grandma, so I'm just going to say grandma beat me when I was a kid, right? We don't do that. We tend to do the opposite. Maybe grandma did beat me when I was a kid, but at the funeral, I talk about how she held me in her arms after the beating, So number 3, what needs to be resurrected? What needs to be resurrected? And you can think about it like this: ideas and people. Ideas and people. Like what is something that maybe died prematurely? Or maybe it died because it didn't get the attention that it needed. right? It's not that God's moved on, like we're discontinuing Saturday night. Right now, I think that it's because our culture, for whatever reason, isn't attending Saturday night in the way. Maybe in the future, we figure out what's different in culture. And maybe we didn't connect what's different in culture with what we should have been doing on Saturday night. And so we resurrect it. Is there anything in your ministry that needs to be resurrected that died prematurely, either because of something you didn't know, or we didn't know, or the person before you didn't know? Or some, I heard the AI guys come together, right? They're going to give $5 billion for AI. And it's so interesting. The guy said that what AI is going to be able to do is cure diseases. So when you early detection with cancer, for example, is that they're going to be able to see early by a blood test what kind of cancer you have. And then AI is going to be able to come up with a vaccine, not just for that kind of cancer, but for your cancer. And they said that they thought diseases would have cures like we'd never seen before. Now, that wasn't Trump, that was them, right? Trump says stuff like that all the time. Some of the best ever, whatever. But anyways, same thing can happen in ministry. We can get new information that allows us to resurrect ideas, but also people. And here's the thing about people being resurrected, and this is where you have to emotionally wrestle with. Often God resurrects people in either different ministries or different churches, right? A resurrection is always a good thing. Life is good, right? When a ministry has life, it is good, even if it died during your watch, right? I mean, you're leading it, and it could have been the culture. It could have been you were too busy. It could have been maybe the church didn't have the money at the time or the staff at the time, whatever. It died. We buried it. We mourned over it. But then somebody came along and they resurrected it. We want to sell it. It's got life now, right? We don't want to have to deal with a bunch of insecurity. No, it's got life. That's never easy. Right? You look over there and say, "Man, I used to lead the 2-year-olds, and I had 2, and now there's 30." And he's like, "Right? No, it's got life. Let's celebrate that." And the same thing is true with people. And sometimes that's within the same church. They move from one ministry to the next, and you even tell the person, which you should, "Hey, I got to tell you, this person, you know, um, blah blah blah." Right? We want to communicate like to one another so we know how to best minister. But maybe they connect better over there. And as a result, their commitment is greater and they resurrect themselves. And we have to give room for them to resurrect themselves. Now, that means maybe they need to apologize, or maybe but you want to give room for that. Your skin will never want to give room, right? It's dead. It died, especially under my watch. It needs to stay buried. It's even more difficult if they resurrect somewhere else at another church. Now, it's not hard if it's somebody that died on Carson's watch, because then you can go like, well, of course, he never watered it, of course it died. But when it's under your watch, right? They turn negative under your watch. They got angry under your watch. They quit ministry over your watch. And then they end up down the road, and now they're serving. And of course, with social media, you don't know what the truth is or not, but they seem to have resurrected. And I think it's important for our emotional health to be able to say, like Paul did. Remember, because they came to Paul and they said, "Paul, these guys are, bad mouthing you." Moses, same thing. Moses, these folks, and both Moses and Paul said, the main thing is that the gospel goes forward. That's a hard place to get to, because every one of us here have our own sense of, ego that goes along with that. Then leads me to the last one, is what needs to be born again. Kind of like flowers that will grow after the fires in California, or the phoenix, right? Doesn't the phoenix come from the ashes? Right? So the question is, what needs to be born? What I put it like this, is what can you use the death of to be fertilizer to start something new? what that has died can be fertilizer to give birth to something new. Right? If God's going to do something new, then what is that? What do you need to give birth to? See, here's the thing about birth. Birth takes courage, right? I mean, babies are not easy to deal with. Um, you know, I'm not a woman, so I've never been pregnant, but I've seen pregnant women. I've been married to a pregnant woman, and it is amazing how much it changes. I've never seen a baby born. I've seen a baby ripped out. Okay. But all of that stuff is amazing, but it's kind of scary, right? Stephanie had trouble with her pregnancy. The Bailey was in ICU, right? Nobody, they used to be really scary, right? The high percentage of babies born didn't live to certain ages. And yet you can't move forward without birth. It ends with one generation without the birth. And it's not just us, right? It is our ministers. Your ministry cannot survive if it doesn't give birth to something new, something fresh. With that is risk. When babies are born, isn't it amazing when you see baby pictures of serial killers or video of little serial killers running around, right? You're like, look how cute he is. And yes, he killed 15 women. Wow, he had his head in his refrigerator. You're like, how did that happen? Because there's no guarantee, is there? Right? You do all that you can, and the Bible, gives us some great confidence. But at the end of the day, you're giving birth to something that has its own life. And that can turn out to be the president, or turn out to be the Pope, or turn out to be, whatever, or it can turn out to be something that's incredibly destructive. And maybe both of those are, I don't know. But right, but there's risk involved, and there is with every new ministry you start. That's why most people are afraid to start them. You hear people today say, "Well, I don't want to have any kids. The world's too crazy." The world is so much more civilized than it's ever been. People have never lived longer than they do today. If nothing like having babies out on the prairie, in the pioneer days, or on the Mayflower as it came across the ocean. Can you imagine? And yet those folks did. Why? Because there was hope in every birth. And the same is true in your ministry. Right? They're not all going to survive. They're not all going to grow into world-changing ministries. But you'll never even be around to impact future generations if our ministries don't give birth to new and innovative, because everything around us is changing. We don't live. We live what, 70 years, 75, 80, 100 if you're blessed and healthy. And so the only way to impact the future is to give birth to something new. And the same is true for ministry. None of us know what God has for us in the future. And if all we try to do is keep alive what's going, then it will eventually die, because everything has a cycle. Bus ministry used to be awesome. It reached thousands and thousands of people. Do you know anybody that has a bus ministry today? Right? It's because the culture changed. Maybe one day they'll come back. Maybe, when it's too expensive to drive, if you've got a bus, people, who knows? But the culture changes, and the churches who did bus ministry and didn't adapt die. Churches, why churches have Sunday night services is because back in the day, people didn't have electricity, but the church did. And so on Sunday night, when it would get dark, it's like, well, what are we going to do? Sit around and pick our toenails? Like, well, if we'll have church, people will come. They may only come because they're bored, but we will come. And then Sunday night became something sacred that even though it was dead, people couldn't kill it. They couldn't bury it. And it impacted, because you all know, the more services we do, the greater impact that it has. Right? And so if we're doing something that's dead, it's detrimentally hurting that which is a lie. And yet they didn't bury it. And again, those churches are what? They're not having the impact that they could. So what are you giving birth to this year? Now, don't be careful, because the temptation is the same thing as having kids, is you want to get everything lined out, right? And that's not real life, right? You can't get married only when you get everything lined out, and you can't have kids. Now, you don't want to be stupid, right? But you can't have kids only when you ever get everything lined out. You've got to have some faith. You got to take a risk. You got to let your heart for adventure, your desire for the innovative, to drive you to do something new. And so I want to challenge us as we go in to this year. I want to challenge you. The last thing I want to say is this, as we think about 2024, and I think it's important in context of what I've said, it's important to for us to think about ourselves, but also to think about potential. Because I think that if we, potential's been around for 47 years. That's a long time. And over those 47 years, it's transitioned. It's looked different. Nobody was out here. And then they were, in this building, but the building faced this way when they were in this building. The auditorium, or the platform was up there, right? Then they went over there and they went over, right? All these different things. I think it's important for us to realize that we are in a new environment culturally. Our country, our politics, our world. It's moving closer to where Europe has been, which I'm praying for revival for it not to go there. But I think all that means that we have to allow the potential of the past to die. And what does that mean? Well, I think it means that you can't compare yourself to something that is dead. You can't compare your stories to the stories of here. We can be inspired by those stories. We can be motivated by those stories, but we can't compare ourselves to those folks, because it's a different time, it's a different world, and it's a different culture. We can't compare our stories. We can't compare our numbers. This is the way I wrote it down. We're at a different time with a different culture, different people, at different ages. Even then, let's say, Steph and I have been here long enough to think for ourselves, for us to continue to be effective, we have to not be old wineskins. We have to be willing to give birth to new things and be willing to bury old things. If you go back, if we go through here and we look at those who have been here for 9 or 10 years, just in those 9 or 10 years, I mean, there's a whole, 30 years before that. If we think about the school, right? And we're at a different time. We've been through COVID, right? We've been through a historical presidential politic deal where President Trump won, he lost and won. That's only happened one other time. It's a different culture, right? If I go back 10 years from today, nobody was talking about pronouns. Nobody's asking, are you he, she, they, their, right? Nobody's talking about transgenderism. And it's a different group of people. Only a few maybe were here 10 years ago or even further. So it's a different group of people, which means it's a different dynamic, different strengths, different abilities, different gifts. And we're at different ages. When I came here, the staff was all in its 40s. And so you have to let the past be celebrated, be inspirational, but you have to let it die. AI changes everything. So there's no way with all of those changes, politics, I used to be able to make jokes about the president no matter who they were. Now you're going to make somebody mad if you mention politics at all. Right? So all of that has changed. And I say all that so that we can ask ourselves the questions as we go into this year. What needs to die? What needs a funeral? what needs to be resurrected and what needs to be born. And here's I guess the main question is do you see it? What do you see? The next wave is coming. Do you see it? That's important. And it's only a question that you can answer. Because life is full of seasons. And only you know whether you can see it. Steph and I left Arkansas because I couldn't see it anymore. We started the church. We had a vision for the church, a passion for the church. But I got to the point where I just couldn't see it anymore. And I don't want to pretend, and I don't want to play. I don't want to just go through the motions. Life is too short. What God's called us all to do is too important. So it's not a hard question. Just maybe a difficult one to live with sometimes. Do you see? And if you don't, maybe you need to be as responsible as the rock and hand in your resignation. Doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Doesn't mean that God doesn't have a plan for you. But you want to be a part of what you can see. You know, at the end of the movie, after the battle, you would think, you know, at the end, after fighting the Krampus and all the struggles to keep, you know, he has to rescue Santa and all of that. And it's through the battle and the struggle and the difficulty that he takes back his resignation, right? I mean, it'd be a horrible movie if he left, right? I wouldn't have watched it all. I'd have quit, okay? But because he says, I see it again. So we may go through seasons where it's dim. We may go through seasons where you have to squint and where it's challenging. But then in those moments, it's important to kind of step back and ask ourselves, can I still see it, God? Right? Where do I need to position myself so I can see it? So I can be a part of what you're doing. My prayer is always that all of us everywhere will continue to be a part of what God is doing at Potential Church. It's incredibly sad anytime somebody decides that, even if they're called to do something different. But most importantly, life is short and the world needs called people who can see it. And so it's important that we're all in a place where we can see it. That when we show up on the weekend, or we get a card, or we make a call, that we're not just looking at a name or a human, but we're seeing God's creation that He has so willingly put within your hand to develop, to challenge, to inspire, to discipline, whatever it is, but not just a task and not just something that you have to do in order to get a paycheck at the end of the day. It's so much greater than that. Do you see it? Do you see the potential within every child that comes to this school? The potential of every person shows up on the weekend. Those who are getting all to God and those who slept with 3 different people the night before. Let's bow our heads.